Okay. All right. We will make a start. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Got those in the wrong order to give you the east to west side of it, but wherever you are, welcome. My name's Brian Tucker. I'm a principal consultant at Eva Jacobson International. I've been teaching and coaching the Scaled Agile framework for an awfully long time. I've been with it since its nascent beginnings some 15 years ago as a drawing in the frontispiece of Dean Leffingwell's book on agile software requirements. In that time, I've supported clients in most engineering industries, be it software or hardware, regulated and unregulated environments. And in terms of teaching, I was one of the first people outside of Scaled Agile entitled to teach implementing SAFe and certify SPCs. I've run that course almost 150 times now over the last 10 years, more than anyone else in the world. Need that. There we go. This is the second in a series of webinars that look at the primary work items within SAFe: epics, features, and stories. The first webinar covered epics, changing the business. Recordings are available on the IGI website. The second webinar, covers features, potentially releasable points which change systems, solutions, services, or products. And finally, on the 8th of August, it will be the turn of stories, changes to the underlying artifacts that make those systems or solutions, be they a code base, mechanical designs, or marketing copy. The QR code gets you a printable version of the Ready Reckoner on the right. Keep an eye out for those throughout the presentation. They link to additional information supporting the topics being discussed. There should also be time for a question and answer session at the end. Use the Q&A functionality within Zoom to register your questions. And as I did with the epics webinar, I'll try to write up the answers to all of the questions, even those that don't get answered here and now. Keep an eye out for that going up on the IGI website, or subscribe to the newsletter so you get notified. We should probably understand what epics are. Epics features are before we try to make them better. And before we go any further, we need to talk about backlog management tooling, particularly backlog management tooling that has been configured for small scale teams and is using the traditional definition of epic, which was a big story. SAFe features might be epics as far as your backlog tooling is concerned, and SAFe epics would be initiatives. Hence me getting my words muddled up at the beginning of this slide. In defense of the tooling providers, the tooling is fully configurable, but many organizations either can't be bothered to invest in configuring it, or they've misinterpreted the part of the regulations that state that teams must be following a documented process. They've assumed that locking the backlog management tooling down is the same as following a documented process. Ignorance is bliss. Put your tooling naming conventions aside as we explore what SAFe features are. Think about the big systems that your organizations are developing. Can you deliver releasable end customer value in the day or two that is the ideal size for a team level user story? Probably not. Can you deliver releasable end customer value in the 2 weeks that is the recommended size for a sprint and an iteration at the team level, and that stories have to fit within? That can be quite hard as well. But stories have to fit within that iteration. And if they won't fit in the 2 weeks, we're going to have to make our iterations bigger. Is that the right customization to make? Probably not. The longer the iteration, the less feedback the team receives. And that's going to be compromising a whole bunch of principles from both the Agile Manifesto and SAFe's own principles. The fix is not to increase the time boxes, but to introduce a level of aggregation. This is where SAFe features come in. They can represent end customer value whilst allowing the stories to remain small. increments that track progress and generate rapid feedback on what's been done. To be clear, stories are still end customer deployable value, but they don't have to be releasable in their own right. Features become the release points. Stories might be an individual buttons on web pages the customer wants and expects, but it makes no sense to release them until there are sufficient buttons on the web page to allow the customer to achieve something useful. The feature would capture what that useful thing is. If features are potentially releasable points, then they need to contain all of the work to make the feature releasable. And releasable is more than just doing the engineering. Has the documentation been updated? User manuals, internal technical documentation for those poor engineers that come after us, regulatory compliance paperwork. Have the bigger tests been done? An end-to-end test isn't necessarily going to arise as the sum of all the unit tests on the stories that make up the feature. It might need to be created explicitly. There are many tests that aren't economically viable to run on a per story basis, but should be run on a per feature basis. Exploratory tests that require human input, such as security tests, tests where there are resource constraints. My personal experience is with network stress tests. These have to be done on a separate network, and there may only be one network for doing those tests. You don't do a network stress test on the corporate network because they're designed to test the network to the point of collapse. And in my experience, bringing down the corporate network tends to be, at worst, a career limiting move. At best, an awful lot of explaining. What about the things that we know we need to engineer in? Logging and metrics in the code, debug headers and measurement points would be the equivalent in electronic design. For mechanical engineering, it would be maintenance access, lubrication points, service functionality for easily replacing parts that regularly wear. The business might not request this, but the engineers need to remember it because they'll be responsible for maintaining these systems in the future. The definition of done for features, or a solution or system increment, as Scaled Agile tend to refer to it, lists all of the extra work the engineering teams need to consider. Use it as a tool during planning to help influence the creation of stories. I've been saying potentially releasable, and that's because whilst the engineers should be doing everything in their power to ensure that a feature leaves the system in a releasable state, the organization might choose not to release the feature immediately. It becomes a business decision when to release, when the customers are ready, or maybe you are trying to align with other activities, market events like an advertising campaign, or market rhythms like the holiday period. That's all the practicalities of the engineering to get a feature released. But way back at the very beginning, when the feature is written, write it as something that can be released, not just a block of work to be done. Remember, the value may be internal as much as it is external. Enabler features, building prototypes or running experiments, they are releasing knowledge to the organization to manage risks, make decisions, and plan better in the future. Enabler features, building architecture or infrastructure, are releasing internal value to the organization so that it can build the external end customer value better, faster, cheaper, happier in the future. Features are constrained to the planning interval, the time box that an agile release train uses to manage planning, execution, and governance. Would you want one feature that fills the whole of the planning interval and takes all of the train's time and effort? No. You'll never get it delivered. Something will go wrong, and there's no value if the feature is incomplete. The agile release train should be tackling a number of features within the planning interval. Don't go too far the other way. Don't make features so small that they're really stories. If you can release individual stories and each story is true end customer value, then you don't need to scale. And always remember that the first rule of scaling is don't. Features are constrained to the agile release train. Whilst they must be deliverable by the train, many teams may be collaborating to deliver the feature. This scenario is particularly likely if the teams are complex subsystem or platform teams. The end-to-end features will span across the teams. The cheat sheet linked to back at the beginning of this webinar outlines the constraints of all the backlog items, including features, and the QR code here links to my completely unofficial rules for scaling agility. Now that we've seen what features are, potentially releasable pieces of customer value, a quick look at the journey they go on to become releasable pieces of end user value. They are requested. Someone has an idea for a feature, simply captured as a title and a benefit to keep the barrier to entry low. Maybe an initial estimate so that it can be used in forecasting and road mapping, but no more detail than that. Ready is where the detail gets added to the feature. Ready for PI planning. Don't waste effort elaborating features that aren't needed for the next PI planning event. Focus on the ones that are in the next PI planning event. Committed. In PI planning, the teams have created the stories that will realize the feature and raise their hands to commit to the plan. Previewed. Try to demonstrate the feature as early as possible. That demonstration can be used to generate feedback to steer the feature towards completion. If you only demonstrate at the end, you can never be quicker because you'll never realize that you perhaps didn't need everything you thought you would. Accepted. The business represented by the product manager is happy that this feature fulfills the needs of the business. Assess the value, not completion of the work. You might have achieved the value without completing all the work that was identified in planning, or the work may have evolved during delivery. Released. Important because once it's in the hands of the end customers, we know that we can start measuring to see whether the benefit hypothesis has been proven and successful. The benefit hypothesis has been proven. If the metrics show that it hasn't been successful, then scientific method can turn that knowledge into a benefit because now we know what the customers don't want and can avoid doing the same again in the future. The states that a feature goes through are not the process. The states are universal, applicable to all, but your process is yours. You may have many process steps to get the feature to the next state. You might have just one. You should be evolving your process, changing it to suit your reality. But even as the process evolves, the underlying states remain universal. By talking about the underlying states, we avoid getting caught up in everyone's personal interpretation of the process. The QR code links to a webinar on this very topic. Whilst they do have a life cycle, the title of this webinar is Writing Better Features. So it's going to focus on the suggested and ready states. Let's explore where features come from. Well, if you interpret the diagrams literally, and some people's brains are wired for very literal interpretation, then features come from epics. The epic owner dictates to the product manager what the features are. And it's from this that some of the criticisms of SAFe arise. Perhaps those critics are very literally minded. But it doesn't have to be a dictatorship, although this is what many organizations fall into because they're recreating the old behaviors within the new system rather than using the new system to encourage behavioral change. Ideally, the product manager responsible for the backlog of features would be empowered with the responsibility for the product and everything associated with the product. That's why the advanced product management course that Scaled Agile provides talks very little about SAFe, but instead covers techniques for interacting with customers, talks about viability and sustainability of the product and pricing strategies, true product ownership. The product manager is engaging with the customers and facilitating the product owners within the Agile release train to engage with the customers too. Collaboratively, as the product management team, they own the product. Therefore, the product management team is best placed to understand the customer's needs and should be soliciting ideas, features from the customers. This is the sort of product management, product ownership that Marty Kagan encourages. He doesn't like SAFe. Perhaps he's also one of those interprets the diagrams too literally. But the only thing stopping the product management team from being truly empowered is the will of the organization. And that's true regardless of whatever framework is being utilized. Without wanting to denigrate anyone currently in the product manager role, often organizations put an individual in place as a proxy rather than the person that is ultimately accountable for the product. And of course, that always creates an extra layer of communication that possibly doesn't need to be there. If we have empowered our product managers to truly own the product, then what of epics and epic owners? The epic provides intent for a change to the business. The epic owner is communicating that intent. The product management team can work with the customers to solicit features that would fulfill that intent. As those features eventually get released, the metrics on the epic prove whether they have fulfilled the intent of the epic, and that influences the product management team's conversations about what should be done next. It's not just the epic. The portfolio vision provides intent as well. An organization can't blindly do whatever the customers desire. The customer requests need to be compared against the vision for the organization to ensure that the organization is viable into the future. SAFe principle number 8, unlock the intrinsic motivation of knowledge workers. Knowledge workers know more about doing their work than the management do. This statement also applies when you look at the hierarchies within SAFe. Better features arise from the people creating them being the people that know the product, being the people closest to the customers and interacting with them continually. Product management should know more about their specific product than the portfolio. Connect with the customer. It's a step in the business agility value stream. It's on the responsibility wheels of both product managers and product owners. And it's an absolute necessity if the organization wants to be customer-centric. Features can have many customers. The users are one customer for sure, and they can be both end customers or an internal customer. But there are others. Regulatory bodies. If the regulator's needs aren't satisfied, then the user's needs are irrelevant because the product won't be allowed to reach them. The engineers within the train are also a customer because they are the recipients of their own work. They need to take it and maintain it or build upon it to create new functionality. This isn't a webinar about design thinking techniques, and I'm fully willing to raise my hands and admit that whilst I can do it, I'm no expert on design thinking techniques. The details of how you interact with the customer, how you get their needs from them into the features, that's for you to work out. Different customers, even to the same feature, may have different interaction patterns and require different engagement techniques. That those needs have been found from all of the different customers is what's important. Feature-driven delivery. It's a great idea. It tries to get development teams to think about units of releasable value, generally focused on customer needs. But feature-driven delivery has its own challenges. If you just start piling up features without thought as to how they fit together, then you will encounter problems. Feature-orientated teams. We love them because they get stuff done quickly by minimizing handoffs and collaborations. But if they're all operating independently, doing things their way, then the internal structure of the product is going to be a mess. To quote Dave Thomas, big upfront design is dumb, but no upfront design is dumber. Know your product. Know where your product is trying to get to, the vision for the product, both business and technical. Then you know where your features fit and how they interact with each other, both from a business and technical perspective. When you have teams collaborating, which is what Agile release trains are for, then there needs to be a common strategy and the discipline to follow that strategy. The strategy doesn't have to be decided by a single person, the product manager or the system architect. It should be a collaborative decision, which allows everyone in the release train to participate if they want to. To a man that does know not what, try again. To a man that does not know what product he is building, no feature is the right feature. Seneca, AD 63. Or at least he said something very, very similar to that. Honest. Many minds minimize mistakes. I always adore an alliteration. Design thinking has solicited the ideas of features. Those that are going to be taken into the next PI planning need elaboration so that everyone understands what the challenge represented by those features are. Those that aren't going into the next PI planning can wait their turn. No point devoting effort to them right now. How do we know what's going into the next planning interval? Well, road mapping techniques, or at the very worst, comparing a sum of estimates against a historic velocity. Elaboration is best done as a collaborative activity. And every time I say collaboration, think knowledge transfer. The elaboration of features is done collaboratively by the product management, product owner group, through them questioning stakeholders and users about what they want. This transfers knowledge from the people, the users that have a need, to the people, the product owners, that can fulfill that need by getting their team or teams to undertake the work to fulfill the user needs of the feature. That the recipients of the work item, in this case, the product owners, create the work item is a powerful trick. It means they have understood enough to be able to write it down. At worst, they know who the expert is and can arrange for them to explain it to the team. This also empowers the product owners to actively participate in ownership of the product, which avoids them becoming mere messengers, which is another criticism of SAFe that arises from bad interpretations of the framework. Many minds, many perspectives. You're bringing the collective brain power of the group to elaborating the feature rather than a single individual. Therefore, much greater chance of catching errors and mistakes. But product ownership isn't the only input to elaborating a feature. There needs to be technical input as well. Architecture, compliance, security, UI, UX. These might all have input into the feature. Getting those inputs in early so they steer the development is preferable to those roles acting as gatekeepers at the end and throwing work back. This early input is the shift left to earlier in the timeline that you'll so often hear in Agile circles. Now, don't take my list of roles as exhaustive. You or your product management and product owners need to work out who should be collaborating to elaborate the feature, and invite those subject matter experts along. Collaboration is knowledge transfer, product knowledge towards the technical people, technical knowledge towards the product staff. Enough knowledge to know when to involve the specialist knowledge directly in conversations. Now, I sort of fell into my own trap. I started discussing better written features rather than following the design thinking trick of asking why are better written features needed. Perhaps I can make some amends now. Those of you that have viewed the Epic webinar will already know where this is heading, the plot twist in the middle of the webinar. You see, it's not the written words that make a better feature. It's everything behind those words. And the clues have been there in the discussions about what a feature is and where it comes from. The feature is a piece of potentially releasable value, complete and ready to go. It is understanding the customer needs. It is having a product strategy, so you know how the feature fits into the product. And collaboration during the elaboration of the feature has ensured that all the viewpoints have been considered, both technical and business. Harness principle, safe principle number 8, unlock the intrinsic motivation of knowledge workers. We've discussed how the product managers and product owners should be empowered to discover features that meet the business needs rather than the portfolio dictating to them. That now needs to happen recursively. The product managers and product owners need to empower the teams. Don't tell the teams what to do, pose challenges, problems for them to solve. If you tell the teams what to do, then they won't think for themselves. They will blindly follow the instructions. They will happily and unquestioningly assemble the given pieces into a plan without thought. Congratulations, you've just successfully recreated the old process, but with a new agile overhead and without any of the benefits that agility brings. You have to ask why you even bothered transforming in the first place. What we need to do is to empower our workforce to think. You've employed them as engineers, problem solvers. Let's get them solving problems. Stop treating them as glorified typists. Features are problems to solve, typically new functionality that the business desires in the solution. But it could be knowledge that the business needs to acquire through investigation or experimentation. It could be the challenge of improving the processes or tooling to make the organization more effective. Features are the what, not the how. The how comes through PI planning, through the creation of stories that change the underlying artifacts, be that a code base, physical designs, or documentation. This is safe principle number 8. Unlock the intrinsic motivation of knowledge workers and the fact that knowledge workers know more about manipulating the underlying artifacts than the management do. If the workers don't know how to manipulate the underlying artifacts, then you've got a more fundamental problem that needs solving first. And we've all seen instances where development has been outsourced to a bunch of engineers that don't know anything about the systems they're being asked to develop. It's not the fault of the engineers, it's the fault of a management that don't understand that managing engineering creativity is different to managing manual labor. With principle number 8 comes principle number 9, decentralized decision-making. If the teams know more about doing their work, then you have to decentralize to them. Hence the screen grab of David Marquet's video. Features provide the intent to allow the teams to work out how to change the artifacts they're responsible for. Where's the customer? The format of a feature is title, benefits hypothesis, and acceptance criteria on the back, or the box underneath in the electronic tooling. The who of the feature isn't explicit in the formatting of the feature, but it should be captured. The earlier discussion on connecting to the customer showed that a feature might have multiple customers. It might not be a single who. Do you capture it in the benefit hypothesis, in the acceptance criteria, or just a note on the bottom of the feature? Ultimately, it doesn't matter how it is recorded. What matters is that it is understood and can be communicated, verbally if necessary, by the product staff. So the teams know who to talk to. Estimation. I don't really want to open the can of worms that is estimation. This is supposed to be a 30-minute webinar, but the estimation on that might be a little bit off. But the topic of estimation itself, it will happily eat up at least a couple of days, possibly a couple of weeks. What I do want to talk about, though, is the fact that there are two parts to estimation. There is knowledge of the thing being estimated, and there is knowledge of ourselves as a team, that we can solve the problems, the challenges that we will face in the future. Many teams lack confidence in themselves, that they have the skills and knowledge to solve problems. Therefore, they want to put more and more detail into the work item to get the perfect estimate. This means solving the challenge posed in the work item up front, which is completely the wrong thing to do when we use that estimate for do, don't do decisions, as we do with features. If we decide not to do something, then all that effort to create the solution for the work item, it becomes waste. Maybe a better approach would be to improve the team's confidence in being able to solve problems. The best way to do that is to get them to solve problems, which they'll never do if you keep handing them solutions. Estimation is 90% psychology and 10% process. Why does the team want perfect estimates? What's happened to them in the past? Did the old project managers rain hellfire on the team when they got the estimates wrong, and therefore the team is living in fear? What are the estimates used for? Who are they trying to comfort or appease? Are you trying to hold people too tightly to a set of guesses about how long it's going to take to solve some problems? Problems which have inherent uncertainty in them, because that is the nature of problems and problem solving. I need to slam the lid down before any more worms escape. But that one little detour was important because it leads to discussing what level of detail is needed in the feature. The quadrants shown here are from an exercise in the Release Train Engineers course, where it looks at the positives and negatives of doing more or less pre-planning. It's a useful exercise because it gets people thinking. But ultimately, it's the wrong question. It's not about doing more or less pre-planning. It's about doing the right preparation. Design thinking, the double diamond. Separate the understanding of the problem from designing a solution. Feature preparation is exploration of the problem, setting the boundaries for permissible solutions, but don't fall into determining the solution when exploring the problem, not least because the set of people elaborating the features, maybe product managers and product owners, are not the experts on developing solutions. That's the Agile teams territory. Principle 8 again, isn't it? Therefore, focus on the problem, understand the business, the customer needs, be able to communicate those needs to the teams. Any solutioning that does have to happen wants to be very, very high level. Primarily, it's dependencies. Now, I'm not talking about the internal collaborations within the Agile release train. That's for the engineering teams to work out in PI planning. They should know each other's skills and areas of responsibility. And if they don't know each other's skills, then sharing that knowledge is a great ice-breaking activity for your next PI planning event. The dependencies here are the external dependencies to third parties or other parts of the organization. You know about these up front, or if you don't, then your system architect certainly should. Firstly, start negotiating with whoever is on the other side. Do it as soon as you know the dependency is there, because you want the information resulting from those negotiations to feed into PI planning. If you defer it until after PI planning, it's going to leave a plan full of unresolved risks. If the other side is an agile release train, then your product manager should be negotiating with that agile release train's product manager, negotiating features into the backlog to resolve the dependency. The features can be linked together, and there's no need for any fancy tooling for all of this. Just stick a note in one feature referencing the corresponding feature in the other ART's backlog, and that feature has a note referencing back the other way. Those notes trigger conversations in the teams. They trigger one team to pick up the phone, call the other agile release train to find out who's got the feature. When are they expecting to deliver it? The notes themselves aren't imposing upon the teams. They're empowering them to arrange the collaborations themselves. If the other side of the dependency isn't agile, then it might not be possible to negotiate with them in real time. You might only be able to get a date of when the dependency will be resolved. The agile release train can plan around that date, visualize it on the PI planning board. If the date isn't within this planning interval, then there's no point even contemplating planning any features relating to the dependency. Defer them until the planning interval in which the dependency will be resolved. If you can't get any information back, then consider changing the contractual relationship with the supplier to encourage more collaboration, or find another more collaborative supplier. If the problems are internal, then you've got some fundamental organizational behaviors that need to be changed. Remember, everyone works for the same organization towards the same goals. Internal competition is madness. You should be competing against your competitors, not yourselves. The end result of internal competition will always be selfishness and silos. Features are business needs, solicited from the customers, and those customers often dream big. But big isn't where we want to start. We want to start small and incrementally build up to those big dreams. Even the largest monuments are built one stone at a time. So there is often a need to slice features into more manageable pieces. The patterns for slicing stories were first popularized by Richard Lawrence well over a decade ago, and they have had enduring popularity. Slicing features is very similar, but there are some differences because the resulting slices have to be valuable and releasable in their own right. Some of the tricks that you could do with stories where you defer things until later, like security, scalability, or regulatory concerns, they don't work when slicing features. Release a feature without appropriate security in place, and the internet will instantly own your system and all the data within it. Adding security later is like shutting the stable door after a horse has bolted. So there are some warnings that must be heeded if you are slicing features. Don't defer those non-functional requirements. They have to be dealt with as part of the feature. All of the patterns are about slicing on value, because the resultant slice has to conform to the rules of being a feature, i.e. being a potentially releasable piece of value. Don't slice too early. Only put the effort into slicing when you know that the resultant slice is going to be a feature in the next PI. Keep the big dream whole. Slice a piece off and return what remains of the dream to the backlog, ready to be sliced further on another day. Don't slice if you don't have to. If it's already the right size to fit within a planning interval, then run with it. What is the right size? As a rough rule of thumb, a good size for a feature is roughly 2 weeks worth of work for a team. Now that is an average. Some will be bigger, some will be smaller. Some will spread across multiple teams. But if you follow that logic through, each team ends up with 3 or 4 features per planning interval, which should give them a good chance of getting them finished. Don't slice features up by component to distribute the pieces amongst the teams. By doing so, you are destroying the value. One team doing their piece doesn't mean that the business need is fulfilled. And never invent work to keep teams busy. If there isn't work for a team, then they should use their free time to upskill in an area where there is high demand. Remember, we're optimizing our delivery system, not for utilization, we're optimizing it for value. And by upskilling, they'll be able to contribute to more value deliveries in the future. That upskilling is also how you slowly change from complex subsystem orientated teams towards more stream orientated teams. Don't forget feature testing. The slice has to contain all the testing to prove that it works as expected, including end-to-end, non-functional, and other tests that won't naturally arise as the sum of the unit tests from the stories. In all of this, the definition of done for features is a handy reminder of everything that needs to be considered when evaluating and estimating the resultant slices. Now, I don't have time today to talk through all the patterns in detail. Perhaps that's another webinar on another day, but not today. In conclusion, writing better features isn't about better words. It's about the knowledge and understanding behind those words and doing that preparation in a way that follows our principles and encourages those principles. Releasable value that meets customer needs, fits within a product strategy, and has been elaborated through collaboration with all interested parties. Following design thinking's double diamond, the features are problems for the teams to solve, not solutions to enact, as this encourages the teams to start thinking for themselves. In PI planning, teams pull features from the ART backlog and create a set of stories to realize the value requested in the feature. Some of those stories will go into the team's own backlog. Some stories will be negotiated into other teams' backlogs. So next week, on the 8th of August, my colleague Keith will explore writing better stories. A recording of this webinar will be available on the IHI website within a few days if you want to replay. I will also post a text version as an article on the IHI website at some point, probably next week. As always, there is a wealth of information on the IHI website. And of course, we're always available for coaching, training, and support. Just get in touch. We have maybe 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. Keith, has any come in?
Not yet.
Not yet.
If anybody wants to ask some questions, please do put them in.
Drop them into the Q&A. Feel free. Reorganizing my mice and I can see if anything's coming in. Looks like it's going to be a quiet one then. You can always shout them out as well, given it's a small group. What about capabilities? Capabilities. So capabilities are a grouping mechanism for features. And you need this when you have a number of release trains that are tightly coupled and all need to work together. And you need to make sure that a cross-cutting piece of work and the features that are driving that cross-cutting piece of work, they all end up in the same planning interval. So to do that, we group them together in a capability. But do think of it as a grouping function for keeping a set of features together that need to be planned in the same planning interval. It's not another level, an extra level in the work items hierarchy. And by want of a very short explanation, why do we need to keep things together? Just imagine that we are building an aeroplane. Maybe some of you are, you don't have to imagine, but we're building an aeroplane. We have a release train that deals with the mechanics, a release train that deals with the electronics, and we have a release train that is dealing with the software, because they're all specialist skills, they're not interchangeable. The feature we're after is the aeroplane turning left. So there's a feature in the mechanical trains team backlog to do the mechanical work to turn left, feature in the electronics train, and a feature in the software train. And they all need to come together at the same point in time, because you really don't want to be the test pilot up there trying to turn left to find out that the boys in the electronics train have left the cabling out. Most test pilots I've spoken to have generally considered that sort of situation to be bad, very bad. So it's there to keep things together. Ideally, though, most trains, they just run their own features. You only need them for keeping those things together. So that's capabilities. Okay. Any thoughts, hints on how to build confidence in teams so that they are comfortable with imprecise estimates? Well, always ask yourselves, what are you using those estimates for? From the perspective of the teams, all we are using the estimates for is to give ourselves insight into, does it look like we've taken on enough work and not more work than we can handle? And that's so that when we raise our hands and commit, we know that we're happy with that commitment. That's all the team level estimates are used for. And that's all the team needs them for. So now they have to understand what the estimates are truly being used for. Now, the business, on the other hand, it might want to be using those estimates for forecasting to find out whether it can hit dates and deadlines in the future. But it would be folly, fantasy as well, to expect that your forecasts are precise. They're not. What they're doing is giving us enough insight to understand whether the date, the deadline that we have in mind, whether it looks achievable. And if the answer is no, or it's a little too close for comfort, then that is a trigger for the business, the stakeholders, the product managers, to do something about it now. What can they do? Well, anything not related to that deadline, clear it out the way, deprioritize it, push it out. Maybe they can get more people involved, change the priorities. But you're using that forecasting, that insight, to give you insight into managing your backlogs and managing expectations right here, right now, in the current planning session. But it's never going to tell you that you're going to get a feature at exactly 4:44 on a Thursday afternoon somewhere in 2025. That's folly. That's the illusion of precision, and it is an illusion. So understand how they're being used, make sure people understand how the estimates should be used. And that's where you start to get the confidence back in that these are a tool for ourselves, not a means to beat us over the head. Where does use case documentation fit in? Now, I will fully admit and raise my hands here, I'm not the use case expert. Keith, who is hiding in the background, is actually the more of the use case expert than me. But at a very high level, without getting into all the details of use cases are a really good way of providing the vision, the strategy for the product, what it is that it's actually trying to do, and becoming the permanent record for that. They're really good at that. You then would create a feature that would develop a bit of that use case, a slice through it, or even a step in a slice of the use case. And the feature is the trigger for getting work done. Because features, they're not your permanent record of the system. Nobody ever goes into the backlog tool and looks at the features and tries to work out what the system is doing by summing up all the features. They are just triggers, change requests to get things changed, to change the system. So use cases end up being a really good way of acting as the permanent record. Do you have anything else to add to that, Keith, given that you are the one that is the expert there and are busy rewriting the book?
Just to say that not only with documentation, but use cases, we could use it to drive all of this, so that use cases could be epics, small use cases could be the features, the value that the features are delivering, or if the use case is large, then we could do what we call slicing a use case, which is something that's described in use case 3.0, which is described in more detail on our website. We have training about this also.
Yeah, cool. Okay. What would you suggest on creating value-driven objectives for challenging domains such as analytics work? Yeah, I've come up with this a couple of times. And it's not just things like analytics work, but anywhere that you are doing experimentation, you can start hitting problems with the objectives, because people want to write an objective that predicts the outcome of the experiment, when that's why you're running the experiment. So the way you handle those sort of objectives is to write them as you will run the experiment and find an answer. What that answer is, you can't enshrine in the objective, because that's why you're running the experiment. But phrase it as if you're running the experiment. And as long as you've run the experiment and got some results out the end, then you can claim the objective is done. And the results, the knowledge that is gained, that will inform what happens later on in successive planning events or decision-making activities. So that's how I tend to run that for those sort of challenging domains where you're doing more experimental work. That is actually discussed in our objectives blog or blog series. Links to that aren't actually in this directly. I can dig them out, and when I write up the answers to these questions, I will make sure I'm referencing out there. The functional size of the piece of software you will build matters to make an estimation. I wouldn't say the functional size of the piece of software when you say the piece of software you build, do you mean the change that you are making? I mean, because yes, the change you are making will affect the estimation. Bigger changes, bigger estimation, tiny changes, tiny estimation. But the actual size of the software that is being changed is possibly somewhat irrelevant. It's the size of the change you're making to it that is going to affect the estimation. Not sure I've answered that one particularly correctly. If you want to drop something into chat to steer me on that one, then I will endeavor to give a better answer as we get into when I go and write it back up later. SAFE also includes the concept of a minimum marketable feature, but the way you explain features now seems to be the same as a minimum marketable feature. How should we think about it? Sort of all features should be a minimum marketable feature, the smallest you can possibly do, and then build things up incrementally. I mean, that's the agile way of working, the incremental approach, isn't it? Build the smallest, and then we'll come back and build more on top and more on top. That's what I'd always have striven for. Now, yes, you have those big dreams where you want to get to, and that's great because it gives you the context. It gives you an idea of where you're heading. Sometimes that's coming from an epic. Sometimes it is just a big dream that exists at the release train level. But we realize them through little features that we're slowly building up over time. And it's important to do that because A, it gets us rapid feedback, which we desire and want, but also you may never reach those dreams. Sorry. It may turn out that just getting the whole of the dream, it's not economically viable. The little bits around the edges at the end, it's not worth doing. There are other more important things we should pursue. So by having all the little bits eventually, by slicing them off as you need them, you don't fall into that trap of thinking you need to do absolutely everything. Just focus on what's most important right here, right now, for this planning event, this planning interval. And that hits time. There's one last one there about confidence. I wonder if that ties in with the other one. I will answer it in the text versions, but we said we'd keep you for an hour. We have. We've hit 5 o'clock my time. Adjust for your own local time zones. Thank you for staying. Thank you for listening. And thank you for participating. I hope it's been useful. Join us in a week's time when Keith will talk us through stories and what happens down at team level.